Cesar Millan has become famous as the dog whisperer, the man who can tame the most untrainable dogs. But now he's being sued, accused of having a pit bull that bit humans and even killed Queen Latifah's dog. Our requests to Millan and Queen Latifah for comment were unanswered in court documents.
He stood in front of the cameras one last time, and he smiled. That's what people remember. The smile. The calm voice. The same steady hands that had calmed thousands of dogs on television, now calming an audience that didn't know they were watching a goodbye. It was bittersweet filming the final episodes, he told his fans, but you haven't seen the last of me yet. No one clapped. No one cried on camera. The show just stopped. 9 seasons. Over 150 episodes. 11 million people a week, at its peak, watching a man walk into the most broken homes in America and somehow leave them calmer than he found them. And then, quietly, it was gone. Fans wanted a reason. A real one. Not a press release. Not a farewell post on Facebook with an exclamation point at the end. They wanted to know what actually happened behind the leash. Because something had clearly shifted. You could feel it if you watched closely enough. In the later seasons, in the interviews, in the way he answered questions a beat slower than he used to. A half-second of hesitation before the certainty came back into his voice. The kind of pause that means nothing on its own, and everything in hindsight. This is the story people think they already know. The dog trainer. The accent. The phrase, calm submissive energy, repeated so many times it became a meme. But underneath that story is another one. Quieter, messier, and far more human than the show ever let on. Not a hidden scandal. Not a secret enemy. Something closer to a man slowly losing the one thing his entire career was built on proving he had control of. His name is Cesar Millan. And before he was the most famous dog trainer on television, he was a kid in Sinaloa, Mexico, who everyone just called the dog boy. He grew up on his grandfather's ranch, surrounded by strays nobody else wanted. While other kids in the village ignored the wild dogs that wandered through, he sat with them. Watched them. Learned the small signals nobody else seemed to notice, the shift in posture before a fight, the stillness before a bite, the difference between a dog that was scared and a dog that was about to become dangerous. At 21, with almost no English and even less money, he crossed into the United States illegally. He slept under a highway overpass. He washed limousines for cash. And somehow, within a few years, he was running a training center in Los Angeles that A-list clients couldn't stop talking about anymore. He was a phenomenon. People didn't just want their dogs fixed, they wanted to be near him, like his calm was something that might rub off if you stood close enough. There's a particular kind of pressure that comes from being seen that way. Not the pressure of fame exactly. The pressure of becoming a symbol. Once people start believing you're the calm in the room, you stop being allowed to be anything else, not tired, not afraid, not uncertain. The performance becomes the job description. But here's the part the show never spent much time on. The calm wasn't always real. Not in the way people assumed. It was a skill, the same way reading a dog's posture was a skill, something he'd built, practiced, refined. And like any skill performed often enough under enough pressure, it started to separate from whatever he actually felt underneath it. Somewhere around 2006, the cracks started to show. Not in him, not yet, but in how the world started looking at him. A New York Times piece that year carried a headline that stuck like a splinter, "Pack of Lies." A respected dog writer picked apart his methods on a national stage, calling them outdated, even dangerous, compared to what behaviorists and veterinarians understood about how dogs actually think. It wasn't a small criticism. It was the kind of article that gets passed around in professional circles for years. He didn't fold. If anything, he doubled down, more confident on camera, more certain in his philosophy. There's a familiar pattern in people who build their entire identity around one ability, when that ability is challenged, the instinct usually isn't to question it. It's to perform it harder, louder, more visibly than before, as if confidence itself could settle the argument. According to people who worked near him during that stretch, the certainty on screen and the tension building behind it were starting to separate from each other, two versions of the same man, increasingly distant from one another, both still smiling for the cameras. By 2004, National Geographic had given him a show. By the mid-2000s, he wasn't just a trainer. Then came the online groups. Pages with names like Anti-Caesar Milan, filled with clip after clip of him using techniques that looked, to a growing number of viewers, less like training and more like force. Choke chains. Pinning dogs to the ground. A philosophy built around the idea that every dog is fighting to become alpha, and that a human has to win that fight first. It worked, on camera. The dogs calmed down. That was the show's whole appeal: chaos walking in, peace walking out, all in 22 minutes. But a small and growing number of trainers and behaviorists started asking a question that the show never really answered: what happens to that dog after the cameras leave? Nobody outside his inner circle could have guessed that the real unraveling wasn't happening with the dogs at all. It was happening at home. In February of 2010, his dog Daddy died. Not just any dog. A 16-year-old pit bull who had been with him since the very beginning, the calm, steady presence he leaned on in nearly every difficult case the show ever filmed. Daddy wasn't a prop. People close to him have said Daddy was closer to a partner. A coworker who couldn't talk back, but somehow always seemed to understand exactly what was needed. He'd had Daddy's whole life mapped out, in a way. There was already a young pit bull named Junior, hand-picked to learn from Daddy, to apprentice under him the way you'd train a successor. Daddy was supposed to retire slowly. Pass the torch. Not just disappear. He didn't have time to process any of it. Just days after Daddy died, his wife of 16 years called him. Not for comfort. For a divorce. Picture that for a second. The man whose entire identity was built around restoring order to chaotic homes. Calm energy, steady leadership, the guy who could walk into anyone's house and fix what was broken, couldn't keep his own home together. The dog who symbolized everything stable about his life was gone. And the marriage that was supposed to be the foundation underneath all of it was ending in the same week. There's a particular kind of silence that settles over a person in moments like that. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just a flatness. The kind that doesn't announce itself, it just sits in a room, in the space between sentences, in the way someone answers a question one word shorter than they normally would. People who only knew him from television wouldn't have noticed it. But the people in the room would have. And it got worse from there. His two teenage sons, caught in the middle of the divorce, started blaming him for what was happening to their family. The same year, he discovered something that maybe should have terrified him sooner. He'd been so consumed with filming, traveling, building the brand, that he had quietly let the business side of his life fall apart. The money wasn't there the way he thought it was. Dog dead. Marriage over. Sons distant. Finances collapsing. All inside a matter of months. He later described that period in stark terms. "I'm a failure," he remembers thinking. "The reason why this has happened is because of me." Not anger at the world, guilt aimed entirely inward. For a man whose entire public identity depended on projecting calm, that kind of internal collapse doesn't show up as crying on camera. It shows up as something far more dangerous, a perfect performance of being fine. By the middle of 2010, according to what he later shared publicly, he had reached what he calls rock bottom. He stopped eating properly. The weight came off fast. And at some point that year, alone with everything that had gone wrong stacking on top of itself, he reached a point where he no longer wanted to be alive, and he acted on it. It wasn't a cry for help aimed at anyone watching, there was no one watching. It wasn't staged, wasn't filmed, wasn't part of any storyline. It was real, and it was quiet, and it nearly cost him his life. His 2 teenage sons found him in time. They called an ambulance. He was hospitalized, unconscious, after what's now publicly known as a suicide attempt, one he would only speak about openly years later, in a documentary, almost as an aside, the way people talk about the worst thing that ever happened to them once enough time has passed to make the words bearable. Here's the part that should sit with you for a second. While all of this was happening, the show was still airing. People were still watching him walk into strangers' homes every week, calmly explaining that dogs mirror the energy of the people around them. That instability in a household always shows up in the dog first. He was teaching that lesson to the entire country while living through the exact thing he was describing. There's no clean way to say that without it sounding almost unbearable. But it's also, in a strange way, the most honest thing about the whole story. The man people trusted to read tension in a room, to notice the things nobody else could see, was somehow the last person to notice it in himself. After he recovered, something in him did shift, even if it wasn't visible to the audience right away. He said he chose not to rely on medication, leaning instead on exercise and on throwing himself back into work. There's a way of reading that choice generously, as discipline, as someone refusing to be defined by his lowest point. There's also a less comfortable reading, that filling every hour with motion is sometimes how people avoid sitting still with what happened to them. Both readings can be true at once. He called it survival. Maybe it was both. The show kept going for 2 more years after that. But if you go back now and rewatch the later seasons with this in mind, certain moments land differently. The pauses before he answers a question. The way he occasionally seems to be working just a little too hard to project certainty. None of it is dramatic. It's subtle. It's the kind of thing you only notice once you know what was happening underneath it. The way a familiar photograph looks different once someone tells you who else was standing just outside the frame. By 2012, the external pressure on the show had been building for years on a completely separate track from his personal life, and the two pressures finally arrived at the same place at the same time. A petition circulated online, gathering well over 10,000 signatures, calling his training methods inhumane and demanding the show be pulled. Animal welfare groups had been vocal for years, but this time it had real momentum. Critics pointed to incidents on camera, a bite during a session, a dog that seemed pushed past its limit, as proof that what audiences were watching as rehabilitation sometimes looked, to trained eyes, like something closer to harm. There's no official confirmation that the petition alone ended the show. National Geographic never gave a single clean answer to why. What seems far more likely, based on the timeline of everything happening around him, is that there wasn't one reason at all. The criticism had been eroding the show's reputation for years, slowly enough that no single article or petition could ever be pointed to as the cause. The financial strain from 2010 hadn't fully resolved. And the man at the center of it all had spent 2 years rebuilding himself in private while still performing certainty in public, week after week, for cameras that never once asked him how he was actually doing. Sometimes an ending isn't a single decision. It's the slow accumulation of 100 small ones, none of them dramatic enough on their own to explain anything, until you look back and realize they were always pointing toward the same place. Something had to give. In September of 2012, it did. The final episode aired quietly. He posted his thank you message to fans. Bittersweet, he called it. And then he stepped away from the show that had defined the last decade of his life. What happened next tells you almost as much as what came before. He didn't disappear. Within months, he was filming a new documentary about his life. The one where, for the first time, he spoke openly about the overdose, the divorce, the dog he lost, the year he calls the worst of his life. It aired on the same network that had carried his show for almost a decade. As if the only way to truly close that chapter was to finally tell people what had actually been happening behind it. He said since then that going through all of it taught him to recognize the signs of depression, in himself, and hopefully sooner, in the people he loves. He's talked about wanting to catch those symptoms in his sons before they ever reached the point he did. There's something almost protective in the way he says it. Like a man trying to make sure his children never learn the lesson the way he had to. 2 years after the show ended, he was back on television with Caesar 911, a new format, higher stakes, dogs in what he calls the red zone. Still rehabilitating animals. Still talking about energy, leadership, calm. But watch those early episodes closely and there's a different quality to him. Less performance. More like someone who's actually lived through what he's describing instead of just narrating it. It's tempting to wrap this up with a clean lesson. Something about resilience, about turning pain into purpose, about the man who hit rock bottom and climbed back out stronger. He's said versions of that himself, in interviews, more than once. But that framing leaves something out. Because for years, an entire country watched him professionally diagnose the emotional instability of other people's households, while quietly carrying an instability of his own that nobody, not even the people closest to him, fully saw until it nearly cost him everything. Maybe that's the actual reason the show feels unfinished, even now, more than a decade later. Not because the cancellation itself was so dramatic. It wasn't. It was a press release and a thank you message and a slow fade from the schedule. It's unfinished because the calm he sold to millions of people every week was never the whole story. And by the time the cameras finally caught up to what was really happening behind it, the show was already over. He still says the dogs taught him everything he knows about people. Maybe the harder truth is that for a long time, he understood dogs better than he understood himself.